Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the owner and founder of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and today, because I've been getting so many requests for this video specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the dismissive avoidant and anxious attachment style dynamic. So we'll go through and talk about sort of how these things came about, what the core wounds are for each attachment style, and sort of how to fix these issues individually and then collectively within the relationship dynamic itself. So first and foremost, there's a great quote by Esther Perel, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but she says something along the lines of, show me what your love relationships were like with your childhood caregivers, and I'll show you how you'll show up in your adult relationships, your adult romantic relationships, essentially. And it's true. Our early caregiver relationships are the greatest predictors for how we are going to behave, and sort of how we attach to our caregivers is going to be a great representation of how we attach in our adult relationship dynamics. And so it's interesting because I find that we really need awareness in order to take the next steps on any healing journey or any sort of journey towards positive and healthier change. And oftentimes people are sort of going through life without even knowing any of, the insights about attachment, and really sort of taking out the patterns that they experience from early childhood and noticing how these patterns apply to their adult caregiver relationships. And so without awareness, it's really hard to sort of create change in this area. So first and foremost, we'll start with the dismissive avoidant. So the dismissive avoidant, and if you watch some of my other videos, this is really deeply clarified in some specific videos about the dismissive avoidant attachment style individually, but they usually come from a pretty high level of emotional neglect. So either one or both parents are extremely neglectful. So, and this may not be, sometimes this is like really hidden, where, this dismissive avoidant child is getting their physical needs met, and they're in a great school, and they play sports, and all this kind of stuff can sort of be apparent on the surface, but they may be getting, very, very little of their emotional needs met. And this can be because their parents or caregivers also didn't get their emotional needs met, and so there was some pain there, or because a parent or caregiver was an addict, or was going through a hard time, or was struggling with a lot of depression or a lot of anxiety. Like, there's a really vast number of reasons for why this can occur. But it's important to know that specifically at the emotional level, there was some kind of neglect. And a lot of this is because it's sort of an unknown. Like, a lot of kids experience emotional neglect because the parent doesn't realize how to be emotionally supportive either. So without going on a tangent here too much, emotional support really looks like somebody asking or inquiring about your personal feelings or personal commitments or your life. So for example, if Sally is used to having an emotional neglectful parent or parents, and she comes home one day and that parent's working on this, they could say, oh, how was your evening? What did you do this evening? Did you have fun? How are you feeling? Are you tired? And so just really tuning in and sort of being attuned to their child's emotional needs. Emotional supportiveness would also look like a parent or caregiver, when they see their child is distressed, to notice and to ask. It doesn't have to be that the parent or caregiver has all the answers or all the solutions, just that they notice and say something. It can also be like providing comfort. If they see that their child is sad, putting an arm around, or just rubbing their back, or just something that's like connecting, just showing that they are there and they're attuned and they're present. Presence is such a key part of this altogether. So when there's a total lack of this, and there's sort of this neglected emotional part of the relationship, maybe they're showing up well physically, maybe they're showing up well even mentally and intellectually, but just not emotionally. Whenever this is occurring, this young child basically learns that their emotions just feel bad because there's sort of this consistent rejection or non-acknowledgement. And so they think that their own emotions are sort of unsafe, and they learn to just repress and reject their own emotions, and they learn to not even want to try to emotionally connect with others because they've got so many stored negative associations here. So they learn to get their emotional needs met or sort of like they learn to soothe themselves essentially, usually through something totally random or external. So this could be through books, this could be through stories, this could be through food, this could be through video games, this could be through like all kinds of different potential sort of strategies, nature, just spending a lot of time alone. Like there's so many different ways, but basically this attachment style learns that they're not going to get their emotional needs met through other people. And so at a very early age, they repress the idea of that sort of existing almost altogether. And anybody who sort of touches on that, the anxious attachment style would be great at touching on that because they really bring all that stuff back to the surface. The dismissive avoidant will feel threatened by, because imagine you do something and you try something consistently and it always brings you pain. So you try to connect with your parents emotionally, you try to express your emotions, you try to look for support, and it always brings you pain. You're like, okay, I'm not going down that painful road again. And then when somebody comes in and tries to bring you down that painful road, you're going to have some serious resistance there going on. A lot of stuff in your nervous system that makes you feel unsafe or threatened or negative or just kind of, shut down. And yet at the same time, there's still a need for it because we are wired for attachment. We're wired to some degree for emotional connection. And so, the dismissive avoidant usually sort of gives into this because there's a need that's there. But then a lot of their wounds and core triggers around feeling bad or about, interpersonal relationships and feeling afraid of being vulnerable and connecting and expressing usually come back sort of around the honeymoon phase is over. And then the anxious attachment style partner is usually like, oh my gosh, who is this? There was this charming, charismatic person, and now I'm getting closer to them and knowing them more, and like, wow, they're causing me a lot of pain. I feel a lot of rejection. So that's sort of like the dismissive avoidant. The anxious attachment style usually had in their, childhood relationships with a parent, either a parent or both parents who were really emotionally supportive and available. And the key part of the anxious attachment style is that comes with some level of incongruency. So it can be that one parent was really loving and caregiving and the other parent was emotionally unavailable or sort of restricted or maybe just always, at the office or doing hobbies or, just always busy and not like very present and there. Or it can be that both parents were really emotionally supportive and connectable, but they both worked a lot. Or, there were so many kids in the family that they couldn't give you their full attention consistently. It can be a whole bunch of different potential dynamics, but the idea is that there's enough emotional support available that child isn't forced to really break into their own sense of self-identity and learn how to self-soothe. And yet, there is a strong incongruency where they are not always getting their emotional needs met. And so there's sort of some pain there, and there's this ongoing fear of abandonment and usually self-interpretation that like, wow, I'm not good enough because I can't keep my parents' attention. So it must be me. It must be something about me. And if I can just people please better or try harder or do more or give more, then maybe I can get this met. And they spend a lot of their times a lot of their lives at a subconscious level trying to sort of like morph themselves into better versions of themselves, more expressive versions of themselves, better people pleasing, more charismatic, more success, like you name it. They keep trying to sort of morph their way around, morph their personalities around so that they can finally just get those needs met that they're seeking. And unfortunately, it's sort of the wrong way of going about fixing the problem. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But there's this huge ongoing fear of abandonment because trauma, when we experience trauma, the subconscious mind, you can look at it this way, it's programmed through repetition plus emotion. So if we have one really painful traumatic experience, like we get hit by a car or there's somebody that we lose or, there's one intense trauma, that creates a really intense emotional imprint. But we could argue that it's actually more painful or there's more stored emotion around the consistency of frequent strong pain. So let me put it this way. Let's say there's a trauma in your life. It's a single trauma, a single event or experience. Let's say that was an 8 out of 10 of pain. Like it was really hard, 8 out of 10 strength of suffering, let's say. But then let's say there was somebody else who experienced a 4 or 5 out of 10, but they experienced that, low level feeling of like emotional deprivation or pain or suffering, every other day or once or twice a week, but almost their entire childhood was like that, we would say in that situation that there's a greater chance, and this isn't always consistent and it's hard to really, measure these things, but what I find is a general pattern is that it's usually the person who went through the consistent pain that was a little lower level but still quite painful, that had more of an impact on the subconscious mind and nervous system, and more of an impact on how we perceive the world and what triggers us now, than the one single event that might have been arguably much more traumatic. So the anxious attachment style is sort of coming from that space. It's like they consistently felt this incongruency. It was like, you're here, you love me, oh my gosh, you're gone and you've abandoned me. You're here, you love me, oh my gosh, you've abandoned me, it must be me, I'm not good enough. I have to be better, I have to try harder, I have to people please more. And so they go through this perpetual, pain. And there's like so much anxiety that gets triggered when they see somebody pulling away, because it's like, no, not this again. There's so much stored emotion there over time, because the subconscious mind essentially stores all of your memories colored with all of the emotions. So it's like you've got this giant cup of pain stored at a subconscious level that you're sort of pulling from, and that gets triggered and activated and brought to the surface and felt in the nervous system. So they also experience a lot of feelings of like not good enough, unloved, rejection is like a really painful one. Like these are super characteristic patterns of the anxious attachment style. And they're still sort of stuck in dependency mode. So they've never really fully broken off, if they're still anxious attachment style, and learned how to completely self-soothe and meet their own needs. Now, neither way is correct. Like, we're not supposed to, the dismissive avoidant really meets their needs and is really good with their boundaries, and they kind of meet their needs through sometimes not the healthiest forms, and they may not even be aware of the highest expression of what their needs are. But for what they need moment to moment, they're good at getting those needs met and not relying on anybody else, because they never really had that experience in the first place. And so, and versus the anxious attachment style sort of has this, worldview of that the relationship is that I meet all of your needs and you meet all of mine, and that's real partnership and true love. And neither one is really correct. We ideally want to get to a space where we feel safe and comfortable properly expressing what our needs are to our partners or to our friendships or to our family relationships, and expressing in a way that's clear, what our feelings are and what our needs are, and feel safe to rely on other people to get those, to meet our needs. And when people are not available, because people will very often not be available, and it's not because they don't love you or they don't care or you're not important. It's because we're all human beings and we all go through sort of different struggles, and we're often trying to just work through our own stuff, let alone be perfect for somebody else. And so people will just not always be available. And instead of, the anxious attachment style sort of perceives this as rejection from their idealistic worldviews about how relationships should be. And so this can be sort of a painful experience to have. And so ideally, you want to feel fully safe being vulnerable, but without the expectation that somebody's going to be perfect. And the moment that somebody's not available, we should be able to rely on ourselves to meet our own needs and be really clear about what those needs are, and be able to set some boundaries and self-soothe in a way that allows us to get our needs met, allows us to sort of be completely independent and have the best of both worlds there. And the dismissive avoidant, wants to sort of know how to be vulnerable and meet other people's needs and feel good about giving and feel good about receiving from other people, and start learning how to trust and open back up again emotionally, which can be a really tough thing initially for the dismissive avoidant to do. So we want to have a nice healthy balance of both there, as opposed to being on polarized ends of one or the other. Okay, so some little discrepancies you'll see here in the relationship. So the anxious attachment style's operating perception is again like two people completely dependent on each other. The dismissive avoidant is like two completely independent people who each meet their own needs, and sort of these are the operating perceptions of the relationship in a way. The anxious attachment style tends to want tons of intimacy, tons of connection, and the dismissive avoidant tends to want like lots of space and freedom. So again, you can see the friction there that's likely to occur. The anxious attachment style tends to want a lot of romanticism, closeness, total commitment, and the dismissive avoidant is like, whoa, I don't want commitment. I don't want to be too engulfed by anybody. I feel, and they'll get triggered by a lot of that. versus the anxious attachment gets triggered by not getting that met. Okay, so some of the patterns you'll see just from hearing that part is that the anxious attachment style can often be like a lot more jealous, possessive. They can play a lot more games by nature because they're just trying to figure out like how to, it comes back to that childhood space, like how to contort themselves in the perfect way to finally get their needs met. So sometimes they'll try to like make their partner jealous, do things that will try to, see if they can elicit an emotional response from their partner. And if they do, they'll take it as reinforcement and validation, like, oh my gosh, my dismissive avoidant partner does actually care. And they're sort of hungering and desperate for that positive reinforcement somehow. To the point where actually the anxious attachment style will often threaten to leave and be like, I'm not doing this anymore. And they're not actually threatening to leave because they're hurt enough that they want the relationship to end, though that can sometimes be the case. But usually in the initial stages, whether conscious or unconscious, the anxious attachment style sort of pushes away and threatens to leave because they're just hoping that their dismissive avoidant partner will ask them to stay. And they're just hoping that they can see at that like last extreme space that, hey, this person actually does care. So usually there's some kind of subconscious, at least, intention to hope that the person will come back in and try to connect and try to hold on to them. And they're sort of looking from that space for just any form of validation they can get their hands on. And the dismissive avoidant is interesting in this case. Like, even though they may not seemingly express so much love and need for connection, at a very deep level, they really crave it. They really need it. And so usually when they start getting like, because the anxious attachment style is a great like lover, like they will be loving and supportive and present and thoughtful and kind and courteous and encouraging. And so, there's sort of this thing that even though the dismissive avoidant partner, this isn't their subconscious comfort zone for what love is or what love looks like, they're like, wow, this feels really good. And when it's threatened to be taken away, usually the dismissive avoidance like, wait, I actually do want this. I want to stay. When there isn't this threat present any longer of engulfment and super commitment from the anxious attachment style requires, when they take that out of the mix and the picture, all of a sudden the anxious or the dismissive avoidant can sort of access a deeper part of themselves that says, hey, wait, I do have these emotional needs. These things are important to me. I actually don't want to lose them. And that usually works initially until the anxious attachment style becomes demanding again, according to the dismissive partner, and they get re-triggered, and then they start to pull away. So oftentimes we'll see this pair or this couple in like this vicious cycle sort of thing. And the anxious attachment style often feels like a pretty consistent form of rejection from their partner. And the dismissive avoidant often feels criticized or trapped. So how do we fix this? So I could put so much content out on this, and this is just one short video, so I won't, overload with information here. But number one, how do we fix this? We have to fix it first as individuals before we fix it in the relationship dynamic. Because if we just do work on the relationship dynamic, but we don't fix the core wounds inherent in each of these attachment styles, then it's kind of like there's no point. It's like it's like putting a Band-Aid on something. You can have these conscious coping mechanisms that say, hey, be more validating, be more supportive. If you haven't fixed this underlying need for connection and interdependency, or, total aversion to being vulnerable, on the anxious side, and then on the dismissive side there, then you're still just coping. You're not solving. You're not really transforming at the root level, at the subconscious mind level, which means it's sort of a matter of time before these patterns resurface, or you're never going to be fully, completely happy. So like in your relationship. So number one, I'm going to start with the anxious attachment and then go into the dismissive. And again, this is just like short form here. Number one, the anxious attachment style needs to learn how to self-soothe. How do we self-soothe? So many people, it's like saying, it's this sort of typical question I get all the time where people are like, you need to love yourself more. And it's like, how do I love myself more? What does that mean? And so I love to look at these things as like externalizing them. So if you are trying to get to know a person in a relationship, how do you end up loving them? Well, first you have to get to know them, and it has to be consistent. This isn't something like this like applies to so many different topics. People will be like, I don't know my life purpose, and they've never like really sat and consistently tried to dig into it and find out. we're not going to just like sit and love ourselves immediately or know our life purpose or just get the answers because we sit down once. We need to learn to study ourselves, to inquire within ourselves, to understand ourselves at a very deep level, to properly be capable of loving ourselves. Just like it's really hard for you to love a stranger walking down the street, by nature. But it's a lot easier to love. I think it's almost difficult not to love somebody that we really deeply know, despite any flaws or incongruencies that they might have or things that they might do. We naturally love when we know, when we understand, and we have to start building that relationship within ourselves, especially as the anxious attachment style. So the anxious attachment style, in order to learn how to self-soothe, first has to learn how to properly self-love and self-care. That's really what that's about. And in order to get to that piece, we have to get to know ourselves first. So this means inquiry of my own emotions, like, noticing what triggers me, noticing what upsets me, getting to know what emotions I experience on a regular, on a daily basis or, at a regular level sort of thing. This also means we have to know like what our needs are. The anxious attachment style has like a consistent habit as a general rule of putting other people's needs first and putting their second, if really at all, into the mix. And in a way, it's because it's still needing one of their own needs. Like they're like, okay, if I can just connect enough, I can get a chance for connection, and connection's a need that they have. But it's like doing things outside in instead of inside out. And that's always sort of destined to fail at one point or another. So it means like, what are my needs in different categories? What do I need emotionally? What do I need in terms of comfort, in terms of security, in terms of growth, in terms of exploration and freedom, like in these different areas of my life? What do I need? What makes me feel good? And a good question to ask yourself is like, what makes you, what do you need to feel happy in this moment? What do you need to feel grateful in this moment? Like you can make it more specific that way. So the anxious attachment style has to get in touch with their needs, get in touch with their feelings, start asking themselves these questions. Hey, what do I feel right now? And what do I need right now? As opposed to remaining this interdependency, hoping that somebody will meet their needs if they're better meeting their partners. They also have to learn how to set boundaries and put themselves first sometimes. This will be huge because it's sort of this like hit to your self-esteem if you're always putting other people first. At a subconscious level, you're emotionally inferring to yourself that you don't matter and that you're not that important. And then when the moment somebody else triggers that in you or makes you feel that way also, it's that much more painful because it's something you've consistently been showing yourself in terms of how you show up for yourself. So imagine this, for example. Imagine that you're with your partner and your partner's always like, hey, your needs don't matter. Just focus on, your mother over here. Just focus on your brother over here. Just focus on your colleagues and your coworkers. You stop talking about your needs. They're not relevant. And they're constantly telling you, hey, your needs don't matter. Just put everybody else first. You would feel like emotionally abused by that person to some degree. And yet, on some level, the anxious attachment style is kind of doing this to themselves. And so there is a natural byproduct of lowered self-esteem, which in turn further ignites their core wounds of feeling rejected and not good enough because they're treating themselves that way too. They are rejecting themselves and they're making themselves matter less, not be as important as everybody else, not feel good enough. Their needs aren't seen and heard. And, as you'll see, the anxious attachment style's core wounds are usually rejected, not good enough, feeling abandoned, just like they abandon the relationship to themselves, and feeling unseen, unheard, and unimportant. Those are usually the key sort of points in there. So those are important to know. The dismissive avoidant needs to learn how to safely rely on others. And this is tricky because, it's when you sort of have like all these negative stored associations, you kind of have to take a leap of faith. And that's something the dismissive avoidant fully has to do. But when they see that they have a supportive partner, what they want to do is reprogram their stored associations around trusting, around vulnerability, around emotionally expressing themselves, so they can start off really small. They can start by not neglecting their own feelings and needs. So, and understanding their feelings and needs differently. So usually, like I sort of mentioned way earlier, the dismissive avoidant will have a lot of they'll know what their needs are moment to moment, and they'll seemingly be great at their boundaries. Like, hey, I don't want to go out tonight. Leave me alone. Or, no, I'm not doing that. Or, they can be quite intense with how they just put a boundary up, and almost like a little bit harsh or brisk sometimes. And it's usually because they know their needs in like a moment-to-moment basis, but they're not necessarily aware of like their deeper needs that sort of constitute that higher expression of themselves. And so that's an important thing to dig into as a dismissive avoidant. Now, what you can do is, start opening up a little bit to yourself about your feelings. Okay, what feelings do I feel on a regular basis? Go through like a feeling chart. There's feeling charts online. I've got them on the website at personaldevelopmentschool.com. And go on there and just notice what your emotions are. Highlight the major ones you experience the most. Start to notice where you feel them in your body. You just have to get in touch with your emotions, seriously. And when you start doing that and just noticing that emotions are really just sensations in the body, they're sort of like the reflection of your thoughts in the body in a way. And when you start to notice that over time and connect to yourself that way, you start to make your feelings safe for you, which then make them safe in relationship dynamics. And then what you want to start doing is slowly but surely, it doesn't have to be like intense or crazy, slowly but surely express your feelings to others. Hey, I'm feeling a little bit hurt when you do that. Hey, I'm feeling a little bit sad in this moment. Hey, I'm feeling optimistic right now about that thing we're doing tomorrow. Excited about it. Just start getting in touch with your feelings and start expressing your feelings and start noticing that, hey, when you express them, people listen, people pay attention. You're not going to be neglected, and start asking for support. You can even say, hey, when I start opening up and expressing my feelings, it's really vulnerable for me and really hard for me. So, do you think you could try to be extra supportive as I'm going through this process? And that's huge. A lot of people, when you're that vulnerable, are going to be super loving and really show up for you in those instances. So that's huge. You also want to challenge some of your stored associations to commitment. Like, you have all these deep-rooted sort of subconscious beliefs that are like, commitment is bad. Commitment takes my energy. Commitment makes me feel like, just challenge them. Is there anything you commit to that makes you feel good? Is there any time you've committed to something and been glad that you've done it? Is committing to relationships really that bad? Is committing to events far in advance really that bad? And you want to test some of those beliefs out, because there's a lot of like, oh, I'm so trapped, I'm so helpless. Are you really? Question it, because you've got all these stored associations from the past. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily accurate representations of the present. And also notice that, I can safely rely on others, and start to notice all the places and times you have relied on others and it actually has been really nice. Because you're challenging the stored associations from the past there by noticing new associations that have an oppositional meaning. So we're using something called oppositional thought there. And that helps equilibrate some of those stored associations in the first place. And lastly, notice how good it feels to give. It feels really good for everybody deep down. And it can be giving in small ways. It can be giving your emotional energy or your presence or your time or a compliment. And just tune in the moment that you give and you see somebody else light up or appreciate. Just tune in. You'll notice it actually feels good, because there's a lot of deep down feelings like, oh my gosh, everybody's out for themselves. I'm out for myself, and everybody else is out for themselves. And God forbid I give some of my resources away. How will I survive? I couldn't rely on people even as a child. How could I possibly rely on people now? There's a lot of these stored associations, and you want to break some of those up too, sort of like scar tissue. And I'll do further videos on that, but you can check out the one that's avoidant attachment styles and emotional neglect, that will talk a little bit more in depth about that as well. So, and lastly, the dismissive avoidant wants to practice vulnerability. Okay, in small little ways, vulnerability to themselves and to others. And as this is happening, so if this is a dynamic between two people, if you see your partner who's dismissive avoidant opening up, you want to go out of your way to hold space. Like, this is their wound. You know that if you don't show up well in this area, it's going to hurt even more. Be gentle to this person. Be thoughtful about this person. Doesn't matter how much stored pain you have and you felt like they had done that to you. You're coming from two different operating spaces. So if this is your partner and you're the anxious attachment style, be extra caring in that point. Positive reinforce with lots of words. Words of affirmation are huge for dismissive avoidance. And the flip side of that is, if you're the dismissive avoidant and you're working on this relationship with your anxious attachment style partner, you want to be more reinforcing with action. So if they're holding great space for you, or vice versa, if they're holding great space for you, you want to intentionally and consciously try to be a little bit more loving and present and extend yourself a little bit emotionally for each time that you see that they're doing things that are reinforcing for you. And if you both work slowly in each of your individual directions and then reinforce each other positively as each of you are aware that you're working through your individual core wounds and then bringing that work into the relationship dynamic, the more positive reinforcement and the more conscientious we are about each other's wounds, the more effective we'll be, the better we'll feel, and the faster we'll heal. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was super long today. And if you get a lot of value out of this, please like it, share it, subscribe to our channel, and feel free to visit www.personaldevelopmentschool.com for worksheets, for upcoming events, client inquiries, all that amazing stuff. Thank you so much.